Hi, everybody. Welcome to Boston Harbor Island State Park. I'm John Horrigan, and for the next hour, we're going to talk about the islands and peninsulas of Boston Harbor in the Boston Harbor Island State Park. Special thanks to our friends at the Wayland Council on Aging for co-sponsoring this telecast. And hello to all of you watching on the Wayland Community Media channel, WayCam. Now, the views and opinions expressed on WayCam Public Media are those of the author and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Wayland Council on Aging or Wayland Community Access and Media Incorporated. Any content that I provide is of my own personal opinion and is not intended to malign any religion, ethnic group, club, organization, company, individual, or anyone or anything. It's a text-driven lecture, benefit of people who have difficulty hearing, or if you're a poor listener like me. So any technical issues, that's on me as well. But maybe one day I'll be able to present to you live at the Wayland Council on Aging. Until then, stay safe, stay happy, stay fit, and stay strong. I hosted a program from 2011 through 2016 known as The Folklorist, and I was lucky enough to win 5 Boston, New England Emmy Awards. I won for writer, host, narrator, best program, etc. But I was lucky enough to receive 20 Boston, New England Emmy Award nominations for my role in the show, 12 Telly Awards, 7 Communicator Awards, and in 2015 and 2016, New TV out of Newton, Massachusetts, which produced The Folklorist, went back-to-back first place in arts and entertainment nationally with the Alliance of Community Media. But it was a critically acclaimed show that nobody was watching. It was canceled in September of 2016. I've been called a time traveler driving without a license as a historian, but I'm a pro sports announcer, having worked with the National Hockey League alumni, including the Boston Bruins, Toronto, Montreal for over 25 years. I worked with the New England Patriots as their basketball and softball announcer. And I was lucky enough to call a Red Sox game at Fenway Park in June of 2012 against Baltimore. And I called 2 outdoor hockey games, the Winter Legends Classic at both Fenway Park and at Gillette Stadium, and Canadian Comedy Basketball Hall of Fame in Audi Quattro Cup. But I love history, New England history especially, including the Revolutionary War, unexplained mysteries. I belong to several historical societies, including Waltham, Marshfield, Duxbury, Watertown. I belong to the Society in Dedham for the apprehension of horse thieves. And I'm an economic historian, a former colonial reenactor with the Lincoln Minutemen, and a member of Solo Together, a reenactors collaborative. So if you want to contact me, shoot me an email, johnhorrigan@hotmail.com, or follow me on Facebook at J.R. Horrigan. That's John Horrigan, historian, pro sports announcer on Facebook. So we're going to tour Boston, Boston Harbor, the channels, Boston Harbor Landfill, Boston Harbor Island State Park, and the Boston Harbor Islands National Recreation Area. So Boston Harbor is a natural harbor and estuary of Massachusetts Bay. It was discovered by John Smith in 1614. That's his map on the right. It was used by the captain of the Mayflower. They were heading for New York, though, but it's relatively topographically accurate. And Boston Harbor has been an important port in American history. Boston Tea Party, December 1773, causing the British to inflict the Boston Port Act and close down Boston in 1774. But Boston would grow through the building of wharves, piers, and new-filled land into the harbor until the 19th century. But by 1660, almost all imports came to the greater Boston area and the New England coast through the waters of Boston Harbor, Salem, Marblehead. A rapid influx of people transformed Boston into a booming city. The harbor is sheltered from Massachusetts Bay and the open Atlantic Ocean by a combination of the Winthrop Peninsula and Deer Island to the north, the hooked Nantasket Peninsula and Point Allerton to the south, and the harbor islands in the middle. Now, the harbor is often described as being split into an inner harbor and an outer harbor, and you can see the dotted line there delineates each. The harbor itself comprises 494 acres, 50 square miles with 180 miles of shoreline and 34 harbor islands and peninsulas. The inner harbor extends from the mouths of the Charles River and the Mystic River, both of which empty into the harbor. And to Logan International Airport in Castle Island. Castle Island was connected to land in 1928. That's where basically the Boston inner harbor meets Boston's outer harbor. So the outer harbor is made up of 3 small bays, Dorchester Bay, Quincy Bay, and Hingham Bay. To seaward, 2 deep water anchorages, President Roads and Nantasket Roads, and they're separated by Long Island. Those are the preferred channels of navigation for any mariner coming in or leaving Boston. Now, there was dredged deep water channels, and they stretched from President Roads to the Inner Harbor, and from Nantasket Roads to the Weymouth Fore River. In Hingham Bay via Hull Gut and West Gut. So the outer harbor is fed by the Neponset River, the Weymouth Fore River, and the Weymouth Back River, and finally the Ware River. Some commercial port facilities are located in the Fore River area, an area which has a history of shipbuilding, including the notable Fore River Shipyard. In the 1830s, members of the maritime community observed that some of the outer harbor islands were visibly deteriorating, and erosion was causing weathered materials and sediment to move from where it was protecting the harbor to where it would do the most harm. A lot of these land islands were deposited there by a glacier 15,000 years ago, and they were much larger in colonial times. Now they're eroding. And shifting harbor sediments. Fishermen were complaining. Where's the fish going? Captains of large ships were scraping new shoals. Their navigation charts had become obsolete due to the shifting sediments from decaying islands in Boston Harbor. And although the scientific understanding of hydraulics was still in its infancy, scientists and engineers began to describe Boston Harbor as a series of channels created and maintained by the scouring force and eroding force of water moving in and out of the harbor, river systems, and tidal reservoirs. And this interpretation came to be known as the theory of tidal scour. And during the 19th century, urban growth accelerated and more land was needed. The Ordinance of 1641 extended the property rights of riparian owners from the line of low tide, a maximum distance of 100 rods or 1,600 feet, from the line of high tide. Generally, other states drew the line of private property at high tide, not low tide. But extending the shoreline and land reclamation was not unique to Boston. New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Baltimore, Philadelphia did the same. Just look at this map here. You can see in the dark green the Shawmut Peninsula in Boston as it would have been in the 1600s. And now, of course, it's been built out, etc. We'll talk about that. But Boston Harbor's unique geography inspired the law that made land reclamation such a widespread activity in Boston. By the end of the 19th century, the city had created more land in 2 generations than it had in the previous 2 centuries. Let's take a look at them. Ready? I'll call them out. 1, West Cove, 1803 to 1863. 2, Mill Pond, 1807 to 1829. 3, South Cove, 1806 to 1843. 4, East Cove, 1823 to 1874. 5, South Boston, 1836 to the present. Built out. 6, South Bay, 1850 to the present. 7, Back Bay, 1857 to 1894. 8, Charlestown, 1860 to 1896. 9, Fenway, 1878 through 1890. East Boston, 1880 through the present. Marine Park, 1883 through 1900, including the connection of Castle Island. Columbus Park, 1890 through 1901, and these are the build periods. And finally, Logan Airport, 1922 to the present. You can see it swallow Noddle's Island. So Tri-Mountain was what Boston was called. There were 3 hills on the Shawmut Peninsula: Beacon Hill, Mount Vernon, and Pemberton Hill. And Back Bay was the first to be built: West Cove, Mill Pond, South Cove, and East Cove. Then Dorchester, and they did it from debris from the Great Fire of 1872. Of course, they built out Logan Airport, and today there are tunnels running underneath the sill. This is an engraving of the shaving of Pemberton Hill, circa 1838. They're removing the dirt and using it to fill in the harbor. This is what Tri-Mountain or the Shawmut Peninsula would have looked like to you if you first saw it in 1630, or it was appropriated from the Native Americans. And then this is Beacon Hill being shaved circa 1858, all using the silt and the dirt to build on. And they used debris from the Great Fire of Boston, November 9th, 1872. A large portion of the city sits on man-made land, and structures built on the landfill are supported by dozens of 30 to 40-foot long wood pilings, similar to telephone poles that reach down through the landfill to a harder layer of clay. And these pilings sit entirely below the water table, which protects them from microbes that would attack them in dry air, which would cause rot. And water leaking into the sewers or tunnels can drop the water table below the pilings even in wet years. And a recent drought brought the water table dangerously close to the tops of some of these pilings, putting them at greater risk. Look at the Boston Harbor Island State Park, Bumpkin Island, Calf Island, Gallops Island, Grape Island, Great Brewster Island, Green Island, Hangman Island, Little Calf Island, Little Brewster Island, Outer Brewster Island, Raccoon Island, Sheep Island, and Slate Island. Let's look at Bumpkin Island first. Bumpkin Island was once called Round Island. That's one of two islands in the harbor that were called Round Island, or Bumpkin Island, or Ward's Island. And it's in the Hingham Bay area of Boston Harbor. There it is right there. It's the west of Hull. It's 30 acres of land, 62 acres at tidal. I'll only refer to tidal acreage if it's important. Highest elevation 70 feet, and it was home to Native Americans, a fish drying operation, tenant farmers, a naval training camp, polio patients, and more. But today it's a camping destination with trails lined with wildflowers and a place where you can watch the sunrise from your campsite. A sand spit. This is why it's so dangerous to navigate Boston Harbor with these sand spits that lie just below the water at high tide. Stay in your lanes, mariners. Well, a sand spit's exposed at low tide, and it connects the eastern end of the island to Sunset Point in Hull. See that there. Once a summering site for Native Americans, the island was originally called Round Island by the first English settlers, and they granted it to the town of Weymouth. You can be assured the 34 islands of Boston Harbor were all used in one way or another by the Native Americans, whether they were camps, summer fishing grounds, gardens where they stored seeds, etc. So in the mid-1600s, Samuel Ward was given property rights to the island, and upon his death, he bequeathed it to Harvard College, which leased the island to various tenant farmers for the next 150 years. And you can explore the remains of a stone farmhouse from the early 19th century on Bumpkin, and an old children's hospital. The island hosted a fish drying operation in the early 19th century and a fish smelting operation in the early 20th century. And these images coming up are courtesy of David J. Russo. In 1902, Albert Burridge, a Boston philanthropist, had a summer hospital opened on the island for children with physical disabilities. See the nurses, the patient, and one of the boys. During World War I, the island was used by the U.S. Navy, and German prisoners were also held on the island for a time. German Merchant Marine, German Kriegsmarine from U-boats. And in 1940, the island was used as a facility for polio patients, but the hospital closed during World War II and it burned down in 1946. And again, thank you, David. Several large trees, approximately 100 years old, possibly date to the early hospital period, including white birch, pear, and apple, with a single yew, which was a 1900s ornamental planting, meaning it was brought to the island. You can pick blackberry, raspberry, elderberry. A lot of the islands have sumac, and they also have poison ivy. You can see deer, turkey, herons, egrets, and it's accessible by ferry from George's Island, and it's very beautiful in the fall. The mammals there: white-tailed deer, coyote, raccoon, white-footed mouse, meadow vole, American mink. Now let's go to Grape Island. Highest elevation 70 feet, 10 miles from Long Wharf in Boston, a mile from Hingham. And the tidal sand spits extend from the west end towards Weymouth Neck, which is Webb State Park, and from the east end towards Slate Island. The low tide reveals banks covered in seashells, as well as dark slate and granite rocks, which compose the terrain of the area, including the smaller nearby rocky and appropriately named outcrop Slate Island. Low tide. The 54-acre island doubles in size to 101 acres at low tide. One willow tree survives from the island's early 20th century agricultural use, but predominant trees on the two drumlins of Grape Island, staghorn sumac, gray birch, quaking aspen. It has an abundance of berries: blackberry, dewberry, raspberry, blueberry, huckleberry, elderberry. What about those grapes, though? Well, the DEM, the Department of Environmental Management, planted a vine near the pier there. So there are grapes on Grape Island. In terms of the mammals, white-tailed deer, coyote, meadow vole, gray fox, and American mink. Now, Grape Island possesses a local herd of white-tailed deer, several massive oak trees, and allegedly 2 freshwater springs, which remain off the main path and hidden. There was a gray fox seen on the island up until the year 2012. I saw him myself with my wife when we went camping on Grape Island in 2009. But how did the deer get to Grape Island? Yep, they swam, or they came over at low tide. Of course, the island may have been cultivated prior to European colonization. Absolutely. And Euro-Americans farmed and grazed the island for 300 years up until the 1940s. But since the abandonment of agricultural use, the natural succession of vegetation has created a woody and shrubby landscape. Since it was never used for industry or defense, Grape Island has retained its serenity and natural beauty. Although a fortification was never built in the island, it was the site of a Revolutionary War skirmish called the Grape Island Alarm. And you can see my interpretation of that on the folklorist. You can search for it on YouTube. It's also been called the Grape Island Straw Alarm, the Battle of Grape Island. The inscription on the monument at Webb State Park says, from this site, Weymouth militiamen repulsed an attempt by the British to secure supplies from Grape Island for General Rowe's beleaguered army in Boston. What you're talking about there is a food shortage. Once the British had been routed, they appropriated the homes in Boston, except those of the Loyalists. They shooed the residents off the peninsula, and food was hard to come by. So May 21st, 1775, Colonial General Thomas, at his headquarters in Roxbury, is informed that 4 British sloops, 2 of them armed, had sailed from Boston to the south shore of the bay, and that a number of soldiers were landing at Weymouth. That's what Island Park right there. Nice place. General Thomas ordered 3 companies to march to the support of the inhabitants, but when they arrived, they found the soldiers had not attempted to land at Weymouth, but instead they landed on Grape Island. Now, British boats sailing towards the south shore were a troubling sight to the colonists, and wild rumors quickly spread that the Redcoats were launching an attack on Hingham, Weymouth, or another neighboring town. And again, in the War of 1812, the British, same thing, another food shortage, go up and down the coast, raid farms, raid gardens. But general alarms began to sound as church bells pealed and guns fired to rouse the militia. And Abigail Adams was a witness to the frantic events on that morning when she found the whole town in confusion. In a letter to her husband, John, at the First Continental Congress, she says the report was that 300 had landed and were upon their march into town. The alarm flew like lightning, and men from all parts came flocking down until 2,000 were collected. The Hingham-Weymouth militia then assembled on a point of land next to Grape Island, but the distance from Weymouth shore to the island was too great to launch ships. It was low tide. As the British soldiers were poling down the hay that they needed for their horses and cattle in Boston to feed their army, small arms were fired at them by the colonists in vain. They were too far away, and their musket balls couldn't reach them. So the tide finally came in, and the militia launched their vessels towards Grape Island. And the British soldiers and sailors immediately saw this, and they left the barn from which they were taking hay, made for their boats, and they put off from one end of the island while the colonists landed on the other. In frustration, the colonists burned the barn full of 70 tons of hay to the ground. Then they fired several tons of hay which had been poled down to the water side but left behind by the British, and they even brought off some of the cattle. British sloops fired at them, and they missed, although the colonists claimed to have wounded 3 British soldiers during the exchange. But the barn was demolished and Grape Island would never again be a hay depot for the British. The British escaped with only a couple of tons of hay, and this would mark the second battle of the American Revolution, the first being the Battle of Lexington and Concord. This preceded, a week later, the Battle of Chelsea Creek on May 27th. So the island was owned by a loyalist, by a man by the name of Elisha Levitt, and he had generously offered tons of his hay to the British Army. And he had purchased the island earlier, just a few years before, and he sold it in 1788. But now the colonists were furious. His neighbors considered him to be a turncoat, helping the British, and they marched on his home in Hingham. Now, Elisha Levitt was one of the largest landowners in the region. Among his holdings were several islands in the Boston Harbor, including Grape Island, and also Lovell's Island, George's Island, and half of Gallup's Island. And the islands were largely used for pasturage for cattle and horses and for raising hay. And Levitt had offered his resources, along with his vegetables, to the British during the so-called Provision War that I spoke of, at the outbreak of hostilities of the American Revolution. So, as the angry mob of patriots set out for Levitt's house in Hingham to exact retribution, catching wind of their coming, Elisha, and I think it was his clever wife that came up with this idea, they were ready for them, not with muskets, but with cheese and crackers, food, cake, a cask of wine, a barrel of rum. Even some accounts say they had whiskey there. Dogtown, never try, never win. But the refreshments did the trick and calmed down the patriots. Again, during this time, who wouldn't want a little hay? Give up a little hay for some spirits and food. According to the history of Hingham, quote, they say, following the Grape Island skirmish, enraged citizens turned up on the doorstep of Levitt's mansion to set it alight or for the purpose of doing violence to his person. But the avuncular Levitt and his wife averted trouble and diffused the mob by rolling out a barrel of rum and dispensing its contents liberally. Now, the gentlemen aforesaid, referring to the mob, were received by Mrs. Levitt in elegant dress and urged to walk in and partake of the wine. This unexpected and politic courtesy disarmed the fury of the Whigs, and the threatened violence was drowned in good cheer. That's her idea. Anyways, there's a street bearing Mr. Levitt's name in Hingham. Should also put his wife's name on that too. But here's the foundation of a house that was once inhabited. There were Grape Island stowaways through the years, a few structural remains. One of them was reclusive Amos Pendleton. He was known as Pirate Captain Smith. He was a privateer, and he spent many years as a sailor, and he lived there after the Civil War. Another one was a captain by the name of Billy McLeod. And legend has it he had a pet seal, and he lived on there until he died in 1935, and that's when the federal government took over ownership of Grape Island. And today, it's a favorite spot for any outdoor enthusiast, and you can marvel at nature's beauty by taking a seaside walk, enjoying a camping adventure, or have a relaxing picnic as you take in the sights of the island. This destination is ideal for hiking, sea kayaking, bird watching, and exploring nature. Now, next door to Grape is Slate Island. It's only 12.7 acres, highest elevation of 32 feet, 10.5 miles from Boston, 1 mile from Hingham, 900 feet, though, from the coast of Grape Island. It was once occupied seasonally by Native Americans. They picked the raspberries there and the bayberries there, fished there. But it's inaccessible to the public. There are dense patches of poison ivy. Now, there's no trails on Slate Island, but based on the satellite image, it looks like you could walk around the island at low tide, a journey of about a half mile. And of course, the island gets its name because slate was quarried from it in colonial times, and remnants of the quarry still exist. And during astronomical low tides, Slate Island is actually connected to the mainland, Crow Point and Hingham, by exposed sandbars on its south side. Now, during the 1800s, the island was occupied by a hermit. The island also served as a summer camp and was privately held until the 70s. Hangman Island, permanent size of a half an acre, rising only 3 feet above sea level, the lowest island in the harbor, plus an intertidal zone of a further 5 acres. It's a barren outcrop of bedrock. It has a small pebble beach and serves as a resting place for gulls, ducks, and other seabirds. And you're going to see they're angry nesting birds that officials don't want you to go out there if there's bird nests. And it's always the starting point for any sail outside of the harbor. But looking at Hangman's Island right there, due to its low elevation, the island is difficult to see from the other harbor islands or the mainland, as the island is located between Wallaston Beach, Squantum, Moon, Long, Rainsford, Pettox, and Nut Islands. On a 1775 London chart, this island was labeled Hayman's Island, and it shows a greater area than presently exists. A lot of these islands, as I said, created by glaciers, these drumlins 15,000 years ago, eroded over the years due to wave action and wind. Maybe it was named after a man named Hayman, but the island, as I said, was larger and higher prior to the quarrying. The quarrying helped island disintegrate. In 1882, several fishermen built both fishing shacks on Hangman Island, and reportedly they actually had a garden there with vegetables. That's Hangman. And it's located in the center of Quincy Bay. Hangman Island is comprised of several small, low-lying rock outcrops connected by sandbars, and again, danger to mariners. It lacks prominence. The island's only seen as one passes through the Western Way Channel and looks south. It served as a granite and slate quarry, as the island is composed of low granite and slate outcroppings and a fine gravel beach. So look at that, the bleaching there. That you can see where they actually mined slate there in colonial times. There's saltgrass there, other salt-tolerant herbaceous plants on Hangman. And there are a lot of salt-tolerant herbaceous plants throughout the islands. Now, where did it get its name? Legend says for an 18th century inhabitant, a Norfolk County hangman, who after overseeing many executions just became a bitter old hermit, and he occupied the island in solitary confinement. There's no historical evidence that this island was ever used as a location for hanging criminals, although Edward Rowe Snow, the great folklorist, said, quote, "The gibbet has not been seen there for 300 years. Now, the city of Quincy never took over the island. In fact, when a businessman named Putnam wanted to buy the island and looked to get the deed, John Adams and the mayor of Quincy said, "Who owns this pile of rocks?" They didn't know. And according to Edward Rowe Snow, there are many inhabitants over on this island, Slate Island. Gotta read some Edward Rowe Snow, The Islands of Boston Harbor. Bad book. But there are no known military structures on the island, but there are some remains of a structure which suggests the island certainly once did have some development. There's said that there was a lobster shack occupied by a lobsterman by the name of Bill Greenfield, who is said to have rescued many a stricken sailor in Quincy Bay over the years. And then silt from the dredging of the Western Way Channel excavation was deposited on the island. Took the dirt that they dug up in the channels and put it here. Even from points along the Quincy shoreline, one might only notice Hangman Island when gazing across its landscape at low tide, when the bay is littered with flats and pools. Here's a view of the Prudential Island, from the Prudential building, from Hangman Island. Prudential built in 1964. Let's go to Gallops. It's 23 acres in size, one of the smallest islands in the harbor that was initially formed by the last glacier over 15,000 years ago, a land island. The island now consists of a central upland with eroded cliffs on its eastern and northern sides. Gallops Island. It is 6.5 miles from Long Wharf, highest elevation 79 feet. And you can see the Narrows, which runs between Gallops and Lovell Island and just north of George's Island. Now, with its rocky beaches, beautiful salt spray roses, and vistas atop grassy bluffs, this small island has served a number of purposes over the course of history. Following the glacier's retreat and a subsequent rise in sea level, groups of Native Americans migrated seasonally to the harbor islands to harvest shellfish and finfish from the bays and tidal flats. Wild fruits were gathered on the islands, and later they cultivated their three sisters, corn, beans, and squash. Captain Miles Standish, along with others, explored Gallops Island in 1629. It was once the home of John Gallup, considered to be one of the region's first harbor pilots. And this island later served as the location for a restaurant and an inn, a military camp, a quarantine station, and a radio school. And a century later, during the American Revolution, contingents of French Marines mounted cannon on gallops in both 1778 and 1782 to provide protection for their fleets that were now anchored in Boston Harbor. People forget the Revolution ended in 1783, but the French had ships in there once the British evacuated. So various owners grazed livestock and they raised crops on the island for the next 50 years. In fact, it later became the site of a summer inn owned by Newcomb and Snow families, and they were known for their clam chowder. And in 1833, Margaret Newcomb opened an eatery. She called it Newcomb's Island, and it was heavily frequented during the summer. In 1847, the schooner Nun, which was carrying lime from Thomaston, Maine, burned to its waterline at Gallup's Island. There are many, many shipwrecks over the years. I can't possibly go over them in Boston Harbor, near the islands and shoals and the rocks. In 1852, though, Gallup's Island was housing the city's paupers. They moved the poor people out there. And Gallup's Island was a summer resort in the 1800s up through the Civil War, at which time the resorts were closed and the island was used to house Union troops. Among them, the returning discharged troops and the returning 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment, whose story was told in the film Glory, and their assault on Fort Wagner. Gallup's Island was the first island that millions of immigrants first saw when they came into Boston Harbor. It was the city's quarantine station and a site that was a place of exile for those suffering from communicable disease. By 1886, they were examining over 55,000 immigrants per year who were suffering from smallpox, typhus, and other illnesses. Beginning in 1916, several of the buildings, along with some newly constructed ones, served as a quarantine hospital for the Port of Boston. And the island's use as a quarantine station continued until 1937. And in 1917, Gallup's Island was used as an internment station for German merchant marines. U-boats were off the coast of Massachusetts in both World War I and World War II, sitting outside the harbor in the Cape, Massachusetts Bay. During World War I, Gallup's Island was used, though, also as an infirmary for thousands of American soldiers who had contracted the Spanish flu of 1918 and pneumonia. Many died every day to be replaced by new arrivals. Gallup's Island Quarantine Station was active for 70 years between 1867 and 1937. And in 1939, it became the site of a seaman training station that was converted and expanded into the United States Maritime Service Radio Training School. Between 1940 and 1945, over 5,000 men were trained here in a state-of-the-art facility that contained several dozen buildings, a water tower, and a staff of nearly 300. Look at that. All gone today. Thriving base, a hospital. And of course, as I mentioned, beginning in 1942, the spring of 42, German U-boats began to cross the Atlantic and were sitting just outside Massachusetts Bay, Boston Harbor, and Cape Cod. The reason is, well, obviously any merchant ships going to England to supply the war effort, but also brand new merchant ships were being manufactured in the Weymouth shipyards and being sent to sea. So the German U-boats were trying to pop them as soon as they came out of the harbor, and they were lying in wait for any new merchant ship that came out unescorted. In 1949, a spectacular blaze destroyed Gallup's Island buildings when a stranded fisherman lit a fire on the island to capture the attention of his fishing party. The fire then spread through the grass, destroyed a nearby wharf and several other buildings. And although Gallup's Island is silent now, but traces of that tragedy that once cloaked this former quarantine station in Boston Harbor are now resurfacing from its eroding soil. You see, harsh winter weather has scoured an old cemetery in the island and exposed the remains and coffins of smallpox victims. Forgotten by all but a few, the bodies are among an estimated 234 immigrants and others who succumbed to the disease and were buried here between the 1870s and the early 1900s. The island contains a collection of ornamental trees, planted trees, shrubs, herbaceous plants that date back to its earliest uses, with additional trees that were planted by the Civilian Conservation Corps under FDR in the 1930s. And photographs from the 1940s show that a tree-lined street extended the length of the island. And although the buildings have been demolished, the pathways and foundations still exist and are lined with private hedges and surrounded by paths that cover approximately 3,175 feet. Also present are self-sown sumac, not poisonous sumac, but from its berries, they used to make sumac-ade. I'll stick to the lemonade. Poplar trees, there's poison ivy, bayberries. Colonists would use bayberries as a yellow dye for cloth and for making bayberry candles. It would take 10 pounds of bayberries for a single candle. And the vegetation has been badly damaged in recent years by the island's growing population of rabbits. But today, Gallops was once used as a dump, and there's asbestos on the island, and the island's currently closed to the public, Gallops Island. How about Calf Island? Also known as Apthorpe's Island, it's a windswept island situated 9 miles away from Boston with a permanent land size of 18 acres. Right there. Calf Island. There is a thin layer of soil that supports vegetation, including wild cherry, beach plum, grasses, chives, Loch orange. A 1903 newspaper describes the island: groves of wild cherries, clumps of sumac, precipitous cliffs interspersed with ideal stretches of beach, fringed with wild basaltic rocks, pasturage for 2 jerseys, 2 cows, soil enough for a garden, a miniature pond, and broad stretches of lawn. Time sharing there. There are 18.5 upland acres, and the highest elevation is 38 feet. And of course, it was likely used for seasonal occupation by Native American Indians for thousands of years. In the 17th century, the island was granted to William Brewster of Plymouth Colony, after whom the adjacent islands of Great Brewster, Little Brewster, Middle Brewster, and Outer Brewster are named. And in 1789, the Massachusetts Humane Society constructed a hut of refuge, and James Turner, who later became the keeper of Bug Light at the western end of Brewster Spit, owned the island in 1845, and he built his home from 2 deck houses that washed ashore from the wrecked steamer Ontario. Lots of jets. But he was a slave owner, and even though he was considered to be one of the wealthiest men in Boston during his life, he also owned Long Island and other property in Boston Harbor. Now, in the same year, it was occupied by a small group of lobster fishermen who built small wooden shelters on the island. This is one of my favorites. On July 13th, 1872, professional organized baseball in its 2nd season, the New York Clipper reported as follows: on July 6th, the Boston Reds went into camp on the island in Boston Harbor to fish, shoot, bathe, and recuperate generally for the fall campaign. And they were to practice 2 hours in the morning and evening of each day, as well as indulge in manly sports suited to keep their muscle up. Now, the Boston Red Stockings, they were originally the Cincinnati Red Stockings in 1969 and 1970. They became the Boston Red Stockings. Some of their players came over. So there were high expectations of the team. And so they're well rested, and the Boston Nine returns to Boston. Their fans show up, 2,500 of them. And it's Saturday, July 20th, and they lose their 2nd game of the season to the Troy Haymakers. And the Troy Haymakers were the worst team in the league and would fold that very week. Now, they had illegal boxing matches on the island in 1883. And over the years, several huts and houses were built on Calf Island, including the colonial-style summer estate built by Benjamin P. Cheney Jr. and his wife, actress Julia Arthur, in 1902. The dining room, the billiard room on Calf Island. Today, only ruins remain. Now, Benjamin Pierce Cheney Jr. was an American business executive who had extensive investments in railroad securities and served as the director of Wells Fargo and Company and the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad. But all in on railroads. And then there were 2 panics, the Panic of 1901 and the Panic of 1907. Because he died of heavy financial losses. And the ironic part was that he died of thirst in the desert on his hands and knees near Kingman, Arizona on June 5th, 1942. Ironically, alongside the tracks of his own Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad. Now, he married Julia Arthur, who they called the Queen of Calf Island. She's beautiful. She was an actress who appeared in silent films from 1908 through 1919, and she was very talented. Her last screen performance was a benefit film to aid victims of World War I, and then she went to Broadway, and she made her final Broadway performance in 1921 when she played Lady Macbeth opposite the great Lionel Barrymore. In the 1920s, the Army planned to install a pair of 16-inch guns on Calf Island as part of the harbor defenses of Boston, but the battery on Calf Island was never built. Today, Calf Island is only accessible by private boat. The mammals on Calf Island, only one. What is it? It's the Norway rat. What about Little Calf? Just to the north, 9.2 miles offshore from Long Wharf, Boston. The island has no vegetation, no history of human occupation. It's used for nesting by gulls and cormorants, and they can be very aggressive during their nesting season, very cranky. Now, access by humans is by private boat, but again, due to the birds, it's discouraged by officials. Little Calf Island. What about Great Brewster Island? Acreage, 18.61 acres, highest elevation 105 feet, 8.8 miles from Long Wharf, Great Brewster. It's the largest island in Boston's outer harbor, and it's got spectacular views of Boston's inner harbor, Massachusetts Bay, and Boston Lighthouse. From its 100-foot high bluffs, one can see 4 lighthouses. In terms of animals, the Norway rat and the American mink. Its vegetation cover consists of apple trees, pear trees, sumac, beech roses, grasses, and common reeds. And the gulls are aggressive during nesting season. Here's a photo courtesy of Stephanie Chereau, great historian. I'll talk about her in just a sec. Great Brewster features eroding cliffs, a salt marsh, tidal pools, remains of a military bunker and an observation post, the stone wall foundations of summer cottages, and a large gull colony. There's Stephanie right there. If you want a book about Boston Harbor Islands, this is the book, East of Boston, Notes from the Harbor Islands. Stephanie Chereau, one of the great historians in New England, arguably ever, I would say. She's great. And look at her other books. Boston on Fire is just fantastic. Anyways, to the west side is the Spit. We're going to get to Great Brewster Spit in just a minute. Typical fair weather southwesterly wind creates rough conditions here due to the long wind fetch on the island's west side. East side is rocky and hazardous and is not accessible if there's any ocean swell. Again, named for the elder William Brewster, the first preacher and teacher for Plymouth Colony. And Great Brewster is the largest of the 4 islands in this chain that bear his name. Little, Great, Middle, and Outer, and arguably there's North Brewster Island. We'll talk about that in a sec. Thousands of years before the English settlers came and named the island, Native Americans used it as a summer residence and utilized its natural resources. Remember, the islands are always changing. It's a great story. Oh, this is one you love. Lowell Girls Vacation. This is one that's been studied by Stephanie Chereau. On July 15, 1891, 4 well-educated women from Lowell left for a 2-week vacation on Great Brewster Island, where they stayed in a shack and would refer to Great Brewster Island as the Enchanted Isle. And they called it aristocrat, autocrat, acrobat, and ye scribe, ye merry trippers. These are pages you're going to see of their actual journal and watercolors. So they called the diary, Ye Square Party of Ye Merry Trippers. And it documented their summer adventure in 58 pages of text, photographs, and watercolor illustrations. And this journal revealed their friendship, their sense of humor, along with information on food, leisure, class, the environment, religion, and photography. The journal was found by a Harvard professor in a bookshop at Cape Ann about 20 years ago. And it exhibits the women's camaraderie and the author, Ellen Augusta Whittier's self-awareness, as she never mentions her own name or that of her comrades in the diary. She refers only to the autocrat, the gentle aristocrat, the artistic acrobat, and herself as the voracious scribe. Right here you see the gentle aristocrat. We still don't know her name. There are some assumptions, and the autocrat. lying on the hammock again. So the identities were kept secret purposefully because the reason why is because this trip, 4 young 20-year-old women in their 20s to Boston Harbor Island, unescorted, is scandalous. There's the house that they stayed at on Great Brewster. So they set up housekeeping, and the women spent their time reading, sketching, singing, taking photos, stargazing, praying, gathering wood, and engaging in spirited discussions, all chronicled by the voracious scribe. There's the artistic acrobat, and there's the voracious scribe, Helen. Each night, they read aloud to each other, and they played cards and Halma, which was a board game of the era. As one entry reads, after dinner, instead of our usual walk, we sat on the piazza and enjoyed the beautiful sunset, which filled the sky and water with glory. And when the moon, almost at full, appeared from behind the clouds, we felt that nature had shown us many of her varying moods on this day. We sat in the moonlight until late, discoursing as old friends will, then betook us to the dining room to read aloud a sermon on faithfulness, and then a half hour of Kenilworth, which is likely the novel by Sir Walter Scott, finishes our day. Now, the merry trippers celebrated in their casual island attire, even though photographs showed them in long skirts and hats. Can you imagine how hot that is? Petticoat underneath that for the ladies. But they got privacy. And they hunted clams, but not always successfully. After dinner, aristocrat and autocrat, much preparation of rubbers, old skirts, pails, and spoons, went forth to dig clams for food tomorrow. The scribe and acrobat were left to wash dishes, then to meet the other party at the northern end of the aisle to assist in bringing home the clams. With regret, they left a ruddy sunset and soon found their friends with light pails, cut hands, and long faces, but no clams. The scribe carefully noted the cuisine for each meal on July 27th, for example. Breakfast, tongue and potato, buttered toast, oatmeal tea. And that's the kitchen they used. I'm sure, lady, you can make use out of that. Lunch, crackers, cheese, olives, ginger snaps, milk. Dinner, beef stew, tomato sauce, cake, chocolate. Now, you can probably be rest assured that these are 4 daughters of wealthy businessmen in Lowell, and that they were having provisions sent out to them. They couldn't possibly tote all of that to the island. But they had visitors who brought bread and tomatoes and vegetables, and even the keeper of Boston Light came over from Little Brewster for a chat. And then residents from nearby Cat Island would drop by with letters and the Boston Sunday Globe. Can you imagine they got a copy of the Boston Sunday Globe that was probably sitting on the kitchen table the rest of the week? And the members of the XB Club even managed to send them chocolates. So for these women to have this type of life-changing, memorable experience, you can be sure that they were friends for life. On July 31st, their vacation ended. The women boarded the sailboat for the return home. At 10:30 a.m., we said goodbye to our enchanted isle, so difficult to reach, so hard to leave. The scribe added sadly, we leave behind us the uneventful, idyllic days like no others in our lives, with their placid serenity, their pleasant spice of labor, the unruffled happiness of accustomed comradeship, and all the glory of sea and sky. It's one of the watercolors, Great Brewster. And we do know that it was Helen Augusta Whittier who wrote this. She ran a mill, inherited it from her father in Lowell, and then was put into the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe Institute. 1891. Now look at this depiction. I love this. Look to the 2 women on the right. One, the second in from the right, she's bending her knee, and the other one that looks like they're dancing. Obviously, the girl's a painter, and then the other 2 girls are dancing and just hopping about, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful time. So this is a screenplay waiting to happen. Now, the U.S. government initially purchased enough land in Great Brewster Island to build a seawall in 1848, and the remainder of the island, 21.7 acres in total, was purchased in August of 1917 during World War I for a searchlight station. During the 1920s and 30s, a number of civilian cottages were built there, and the government charged them rent. fact, there were 24 occupants there in 1930. And then the Second World War came. Great Brewster Military Reservation was used during World War II as a mine observation and control station and a gun battery site. The post was built with barracks, a mess hall, and a small officers' quarters, but it was abandoned by the Army in 1946. Here's some pictures. But the great dunes of Great Brewster Island. Some are 100-foot high. And then there's the Great Brewster Spit. It extends southwest from Great Brewster Island, 1.7 miles north of Hull. A great mistake mariners make around these islands is to cut across the Brewster Spit. Do not do that. Stay in your lane, stay in your channels. It extends up to 3/4 of a mile to a rocky outcrop of a ledge in what is a deceptively calm and open stretch of water. And a sand spit, you can see it there in the photo, exposed at low tide, extends for nearly a mile from the southwest side of the island towards George's Island. And mussel beds surround the island and connect Little Brewster at low tide. Then Sandbar, this thing here, look at how it's elevated. It's fully submerged near high tide, and most any boat trying to cross it is going to run aground. I love this picture, friends, of Boston Harbor Island, walking out of Great Brewster Spit. Great Brewster Island is a wild island with rocky beaches, fields of tall grass that blow in the ocean breeze, towering sand dunes, overgrown brush, and wildflowers. Let's go to Green Island, the farthest out in the harbor next to the grave. It's a small barren island in the northeastern corner of the outer Boston Harbor. This was also called North Brewster at one time, so that would have given you 5 Brewster Islands. But aside from Graves Light, Green Island is the furthest outer harbor island from Boston at over 9.5 miles. 2.5 acres of rocky outcrop, rises nearly 45 feet in elevation. It's a nearly barren island, visible from most points in the outer harbor, and from the island there are views to surrounding outer harbor islands and inner harbor islands in the distance. A great vantage point to take pictures pointing back towards Boston. There's sumac and other salt-tolerant herbaceous plants on Green Island, a nesting area for herring gulls, black-backed gulls, cormorants, barn swallows, red-winged blackbirds, and of course the Norway rat. And nesting for cormorants and gulls, they're always in a sour mood during the nesting season. Used by Native Americans for seasonal fishing. There's good striped bass fishing out there. In the early 1600s, it was named for Joseph Green, a well-known merchant who owned the island during colonial times. Here's a view of Green Island looking north from Hypocrite Channel and Half-Tide Rock right there. It's one of the most dangerous places in Boston Harbor. It's where the beach and the south side and Graves Light are visible in the backdrop. And in 1851, during the storm that destroyed Minot's Ledge Light off Cohasset, the tide rose so high that the inhabitants of Green Island had to be rescued by the Boston pilot boat. And during 1845, a 50-year-old seaman named Samuel Choate came to Green Island, and he lived there for the next 20 years. He built a crude house, made his living by fishing, and his diet consisted of lobster, fish, and mussels. And then the storm of 1862, his boat was broken up on the rocks surrounding the island. They brought him back to Boston, and then he just purchased a new boat and paddled right back out to Green Island. He would never leave, even during the coldest winters. But then the severity of the bad winter of 1865, Choate had to be removed from Green Island. He was 70 years old at the time, and he would die in Bridgewater on February 23rd, 1865. I charted the island around Calf Island with some notable landmarks mentioned above: Green Island, Hypocrite Channel, Little Calf, Pope Rock, and Half-Tide Rock. Little Brewster Island, rugged outer harbor island in Boston Harbor, located 9 miles from downtown Boston, permanent size of 13 acres, 52 feet above sea level, and it's bounded by sharp cliffs and sunken crags. Rusty red rocks. Little Brewster. Sparse vegetation, small trees, sumac, grasses. A small freshwater marsh apparently exists on the eastern side of the island. And of course, cormorants, small trees, sumac, grasses, gulls, and other birds, other aggressive birds. And a few affluent Bostonians chose Middle Brewster as a retreat during the Gilded Age of the late 1800s. Remains of homes still remain, including fireplaces, stone walls, and an arch that once supported a bell. The archway on Middle Brewster Island once served as a small belfry for the summer cottage residents of the self-styled Republic of Middle Brewster. The king of Middle Brewster. In 1871, Middle Brewster was bought by Augustus Roos. He was the founder of the Boston Yacht Club, one of Boston's leading lawyers, and he built a luxurious summer villa and commuted to Boston by his yacht, the Gilded Age. Unlike Cheney Jr. and Julia Arthur, you remember them from Calf Island, Russ absolutely didn't insist on having the entire island to himself. In fact, he subdivided the island and rented them out to other millionaires. In fact, Cheney and Julia built a house here in 1890, and they called their mansion the Capstan. You can see other houses there. But they wanted to build an ice house to keep their champagne cold. Serious. Russ said, the rule is only one building, one house per tenant. And so they said, well, they were insulted. We'll go buy an island. And they bought Calf Island, went over there, built a mansion there. And fishermen constructed huts on the island in the mid-1800s. There were working camps for harbor lobstermen until the land was utilized by the U.S. Army. It's surrounded by rocky ledges and dangerous underwater rocks that cannot be seen. Wartime use during the early 1900s ended recreational use of the island, Middle Brewster. Here it is. Between Middle and Outer Brewster, there's a channel known as the Flying Place. This is because of the intense wave action during northeast storms. Then Outer Brewster Island, right here, 20 acres, 78 feet highest elevation, 10 miles from Boston. Outer Brewster. Rocky coastal bedrock ledge, scarred by mining. They would mine out here too, you can see it. And now Bedrock Island there, this island supports the most diverse assemblage of breeding water birds in Boston Harbor. They include the common eider duck, seen here, glossy ibis, and the American oyster catchers. Also, the outer island has a concentration of harbor seals out on the Brewsters. And of course, behind seals come sharks. And there are low shrub thickets and rough fields that cover Outer Brewster's rocky uplands, while staghorn sumac dominates the island. They have a small quaking aspen there. They have one apple tree, one black cherry bush, and they even have a Siberian elm that was planted there. And perhaps the most peculiar thing is the only plant found in Boston Harbor Islands, nowhere else it's found, it's called the slender-leaved goldenrod. Native Americans hunted fowl and fished here. In 1798, Nathaniel Austin bought Outer Brewster Island for $400, and he built an artificial harbor on the island, and he hoped to establish a profitable quarry. He built a house at 27 Harvard Square and another one at 92 Main Street in Charlestown from stone that he mined on Outer Brewster Island. A formation in the Western Cove is referred to as Pulpit Rock, and there's evidence of the 19th century canal there. See that? A fine spring of fresh water and a small pond were described in 1882, and a 16-foot well was used there by lobster fishermen. Outer Brewster. Now, the island was acquired by the government in 1913. In World War II, it was part of the Brewster Islands Military Reservation with a long-range 6-inch gun battery named Battery Jewel and completed in 1943 along with a radar station. Battery Jewel. 3 reinforced concrete barracks, a distillation plant for fresh water, some metal frame buildings, and a 100-foot radar tower disguised as a water tower. And 125 men were on the island before it was abandoned by the Army in 1947. Outer Brewster Island. Raccoon Island. Well, it's right there, just due east of Howe's Neck. 3.6 acres, elevation 30 feet, 7.8 miles from Long Wharf, 700 feet from Howe's Neck and Quincy. Here it is, Raccoon Island. It's got gravel beaches, rocky slopes, bedrock outcroppings. only a small clump of trees on the island, used probably by the Native Americans as a seasonal campsite. And in 1600s, colonists grazed their sheep there. In fact, they called it Sun Island. In 1880s, it was covering 10 acres. It was used for recreational camping parties. And then a religious organization had a summer camp out there. One time there was a house in the island, a small church, but you can walk there at low tide, but it's discouraged. And kids used to camp there in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But there has not been a raccoon sighting there in years. Finally, Sheep Island. Sheep Island. 3.2 upland acres, elevation 10 feet, 9.3 miles from Long Wharf. It was once 25 acres, but it's been eroded away down to 3 acres by wind and water, and there are angry birds there. And it was owned by the town of Weymouth beginning in 1636, used for grazing sheep. It was also called Round Island. And in the 1800s, the island was used by recreational camping parties. Finally, was abandoned. And there haven't been sheep seen there in many, many years. Sheep Island. So the Boston Harbor Islands became a unit of the National Park System in November 1996 by an act of Congress. And the Boston Harbor Islands National Recreation Area comprises 34 islands and peninsulas around Boston Harbor, Hingham Harbor, and Quincy Bay. I'll come back in another time and tell you about the Boston Harbor Islands National Recreation Area. So that's my conclusion on presentation on Boston Harbor Island State Park. I'm John Horrigan for the Wayland Council on Aging. Thank you so much for watching. Take care.